They said we would hear their voice only once, and if humanity failed to understand the meaning of the words that would sound from the sky, there would be no second chance, because even gods do not repeat a verdict twice. And when the first signal tore through the silence of the planet, I understood that fear has a sound, and that sound is like the breathing of a being that does not need air to live, but knows perfectly well how to take it away from us. You call yourselves intelligent. The voice sounded in all languages at once, not loud, but so heavy that the walls of the bunker trembled. But we have been observing you longer than you have been looking at the stars. And all this time you have confused intelligence with greed, and progress with the right to destroy the weaker. And today we have come not as conquerors, but as judges, because there is almost nothing left here to conquer. I looked at the generals, scientists, and politicians who only yesterday were shouting at each other, proving who controlled the world, and now stood in silence, clenching their fists as if they could break reality itself. And in that silence, I heard the whisper of the president, filled not with anger, but with pure despair that no longer hid behind flags. "If this is contact," he whispered, staring at the dark screen where their form was supposed to appear, "then tell me why the hell it sounds like a funeral speech for the entire planet." "Because they are not asking for permission," I answered, feeling the cold slowly crawl up my spine. "They have already decided everything. And now they are simply explaining to us exactly why we will die or survive." The voice returned, harsher, deeper, as if someone were squeezing stars into a fist. And I suddenly realized that this was not a translation, but a direct invasion of consciousness into the very idea of the human I. "We have seen how you created gods to justify war and laws to legalize cruelty, and when your weapons learned to think faster than you, we understood that we could not wait any longer, because a civilization that cannot stop itself always asks someone else to do it for them." One of the generals could not take it, stood up, his voice trembling with anger that tried to disguise itself as courage, but was only fear wrapped in uniform. "If you think that we will surrender, if you believe that fear will make us bow our heads, then you know nothing about humans, because we will fight even against gods, even if there are no chances, even if this is the end." There was a pause. So long it seemed the universe held its breath, and when the answer came, it was calm, almost sad, which was more frightening than any threat. "We know, because that is exactly how you destroyed yourselves on thousands of worlds you never physically reached, but killed long ago with your decisions. And now we want to see whether you are capable of doing what you have never done before, choosing responsibility instead of war." I felt all eyes turned toward me, and in that moment I understood that the real horror had not even begun yet. Because if they are giving a choice, then the price for it will be such that many will wish the choice did not exist at all. They did not explain immediately what the choice was, and that delay was more cruel than any threat, because the human mind always paints worse scenarios than even the coldest judge. And while the silence tightened like a noose, I watched people around me lose their belief in control, and with it, their belief in their own significance. The choice is simple in form, but not in consequences. It finally sounded, and a strange note appeared in the voice, like the fatigue of a being that had seen too many endings. "You either voluntarily give us the right to intervene in your development, or we end your existence quickly, without pain, without stories of heroism that you so love to tell among ruins." The president slowly raised his head, and I saw in his eyes not the fear of death, but the fear of humiliation. The fear that humanity would, for the first time in history, have to admit itself as a child before something older, stronger, and indifferent to our flags. "You are offering us surrender," he said loudly, each word heavy like a gunshot, "to give you control over our decisions, our wars, our technologies, our future, and you call this a chance." "We are offering you survival," the voice replied calmly, "because freedom without responsibility always ends in mass graves, and you have proven this with mathematical precision." One of the scientists, An old man whose hands were trembling not from age but from the awareness of the scale of the moment, stepped forward and spoke as if he were trying to convince not them, but reality itself. If you are so advanced, if you truly understand us better than we understand ourselves, then why not simply fix our mistakes? Why this theater of choice? Why force us to live with guilt for decisions we are not ready to make? The answer came instantly, and it was cruel in its logic. Because what is corrected without consent is not evolution, but castration, and civilizations we saved by force disappeared faster than those we left to die on their own. I felt anger rise in my chest, not toward them, but toward ourselves, toward the fact that we had reached a point where survival itself looked like a bargain with our own pride. And I finally spoke, without asking permission, because silence meant agreement. "And if we agree," I said, staring into the darkness of the screen, "what exactly will you take from us first? Which part of humanity you consider excessive, and which you will call necessary?" Another pause followed, but this time it was heavier, filled with something like compassion, and that was the most frightening part. "We do not take people." It sounded slowly. "We take your justifications, your reasons to kill, your beautiful words for mass death, and that is exactly what always makes you hate us in the end." The general laughed, briefly, sharply, almost hysterically, and in his laughter there was more despair than anger. "So you will make us toothless," he threw back, "strip us of the right to defend ourselves, and call it peace." "We will make you responsible," the voice replied, "and for a species that lives by war, that is worse than any defeat." I understood that the storm was coming, because the choice they gave would split humanity not into countries, but into the very idea of who we want to be. And even before the vote, I felt that someone would inevitably try to disrupt this judgment, even if it meant the end for everyone. The decision had not yet been announced, but humanity had already split faster than any empire in history, because fear always moves quicker than official statements. And while on the surface of the planet, people looked at the sky with hope or hatred, underground, we looked at one another as if anyone in this room could become the one who pressed the button of the end. "We cannot allow this vote to happen," the general hissed, leaning over the table, and there was something fanatical in his eyes, justified by years of war. "Because the moment we agree, we will cease to be a species that determines its own fate, and then death will be more honest than life on a leash." "You speak of honor," the president snapped back, his voice cracking with tension. "But behind that honor stand billions of people who do not even know that you are ready to sacrifice them for the sake of an idea that has long rotted in blood. Better to burn free than to survive as slaves," the general threw back. And there was no pathos in those words, only the firm certainty of a man who had long made peace with mass death as a tool. I intervened, because silence would have meant complicity, and complicity in this moment weighed more than any crime in history. "You are both lying," I said, feeling each word cut through the air. "Because the freedom you are defending has long been costing the lives of those no one asks, and the slavery you fear may turn out to be nothing more than a ban on killing behind beautiful justifications." At that moment, the screens came alive again without warning, and the voice returned. But now there was cold determination in it, as if patience had run out, and time had become a luxury we did not deserve. "We are detecting instability in your decision-making structure," it said, and I felt someone flinch behind me. "And this confirms our observations, because a civilization that cannot reach agreement before its own end is not ready for the future." The president rose sharply, and in that second he looked not like a politician, but like a man upon whose shoulders the weight of all history had fallen. "Give us time," he said firmly. "Not hours, not days, but a few minutes to make a decision without pressure, without your voice in our heads. And if after that you decide that we are not worthy of life, we will accept it without resistance." The pause was long, and for the first time I felt something like hope, but it faded quickly when the answer came with merciless clarity. "You have 7 minutes," the voice said, And if during that time you do not present a unified position, we will consider that your answer. 7 minutes became a battlefield where there were no weapons, but every word struck harder than a bullet. And I watched people who had commanded wars now not know how to convince one another without threats, because the language of peace was foreign to them. If we agree, the scientist said quietly, almost pleading, we will lose part of ourselves. But if we refuse, we will lose everything. And I do not know how to explain this to children who do not even understand that today might be the last day of their world. The general remained silent, but I saw his hand slowly reaching toward the emergency protocol panel. And in that moment, I understood that the real threat was not in the sky, but here among us, in the human readiness to destroy everything rather than admit defeat. Do not do this, I whispered, looking him straight in the eyes, because if you press it, history will remember not our resistance, but our failure to be human at the moment when it mattered most. His gaze wavered, but his finger did not retreat. And then I understood that the next few minutes would determine not only the fate of humanity, but also the answer to the question of whether we deserve a chance at all. Time was draining slowly, almost mockingly, and every second sounded louder than an explosion, because we all knew that the countdown was not merely mathematical, but moral, and that the decision made now would become either a justification or a curse for all future generations, if they were to exist at all. I have spent my whole life preparing for war, the general finally spoke, not moving his hand away from the panel, and for the first time there was no steel in his voice, only fatigue, heavy and deep. I was taught that the enemy is always external, that if someone threatens you, you must destroy them faster than they destroy you. And now you are asking me to believe that the greatest enemy is ourselves, and that is worse than any defeat. No one is asking you to believe, the president replied quietly, but with such tension that the words cut the air. We are asking you not to decide for the entire species that death is the better option, because that decision is convenient only for those who do not want to live with the consequences. I stepped forward, and it felt as if the floor beneath my feet trembled, as though the planet itself were listening to this conversation, holding its breath. If you press it, I said, looking at the general, you will not become a hero of resistance. You will become proof that they were right, that we are so afraid of change, that we would rather erase ourselves from reality than allow anyone to see our true faces without justifications. He closed his eyes, and in that moment, I saw not a soldier, but a man who had lost the meaning of a world where there was no longer a simple line between good and evil. And what if they lie? He whispered. If we give up control, and they slowly, step by step, rewrite us until we cease to be ourselves, and one day we wake up in a silence where there is no hatred, no love, no choice, no pain, only the perfect calm of the dead. The voice intervened again, and this time it was closer, more intimate, as if it were speaking not to humanity, but to each of us individually. We do not promise you happiness. It sounded slowly. We promise you consequences, and if you are afraid of losing pain, then admit honestly that it was pain that fueled your history. The president turned sharply toward the screen, and a firmness entered his voice that no longer sought approval. If we agree, he said, it must be openly, without secret protocols, without hidden control, without gods behind the curtain, because if we lose part of our freedom, then it must be with awareness and with memory of why we did it. The pause was brief, and the answer came almost immediately. We agree, the voice said, because control that fears the light always turns into tyranny. And this is one of the few lessons of yours that we consider valuable. The timer showed the final seconds, and all eyes once again converged on the general, because he was the symbol of the old world that would either let go or strike one last time. His hand slowly withdrew from the panel, as if every millimeter cost years of life, and when it fell, I felt that the tension did not disappear, but merely changed form, becoming something heavier than fear. I will not forgive you for this, he said hoarsely, But I will not be the one who presses the button of the end. And if this is a new world, then let it remember that we entered it not with faith, but with doubt. The voice answered softly, almost with respect. Doubt is the only thing that makes a beginning real. And in that moment I understood that the finale would not be about victory, but about the price we had not even begun to pay. The sky did not explode or shatter into fire as billions of eyes had expected. It simply became different, quieter and heavier, as if the planet itself had realized that from now on, every step would have to be answered for not before gods or history, but before a mirror that no longer lies. The decision has been recorded. It sounded for the last time, and this time the voice did not press or dominate, but spoke as if the work of a judge were finished. From this moment on, you are no longer alone, but you will also no longer be able to hide behind loneliness as a justification. The president slowly sat down, as if he had lost decades in a few minutes, and I saw in him not a victor, but a man who had signed a document without an end date, a document that does not guarantee happiness, but guarantees memory. What happens now? The scientist asked quietly, and there was more fear in his voice than in any siren. Will wars stop? Will weapons disappear? Will people become better? Or have we simply learned to survive under supervision? The voice did not answer immediately, and that pause was more honest than any promise. Now you will see the consequences of your decisions faster, it finally sounded. And you will no longer be able to shift responsibility onto time, chance, or enemies that are convenient to invent. The general stood aside like a shadow of a past era, and when he spoke, his words were stripped of anger, leaving only dry truth. So we will remain exactly as we were, he said. We simply will no longer be able to kill without looking ourselves in the eyes. Exactly, the voice replied. And for many of you, that will be the hardest punishment. The screens went dark, leaving no instructions, no symbols of power, only silence in which there was no one left to blame. And I suddenly realized that the most frightening thing begins not with control, but with the absence of justifications. I went up to the surface and saw people who did not yet know that the world had not been saved or destroyed. It had simply been forced to look at itself without decoration, and in that moment I felt not relief, but responsibility, heavier than the fear of death. We will regret this, the president said, standing beside me and looking at the sky that no longer seemed hostile. But perhaps for the first time in history, we will regret not what we failed to kill in time, but that we did not learn how to live sooner. I said nothing, because the ending of this story did not require words, only time, and if humanity truly deserved a chance, then now it had to prove it not through war and not through faith, but through a daily choice that could no longer be shifted onto anyone else. And somewhere beyond our sky, in a silence where there was no court and no verdicts, someone was simply waiting to see whether a species so afraid of losing freedom could finally understand that it begins where justifications end.